Emma Ashford, you are a senior fellow at the Stimson Centre, a leading foreign affairs think tank. You're also an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University. You're an expert in all things Russia and European politics. Today we're going to talk about the NATO summit, about Ukraine, about the war. What are you going to tell me?
We are headed towards a NATO summit in Vilnius. It's probably going to be a celebration of transatlantic unity with all the European leaders coming together, with a lot of the focus on Ukraine. But I think underneath the surface, there are a lot of tensions over things like European defense spending, whether Europeans are really committing enough to NATO, and what the future course of the war is going to be.
Emma, last time we spoke, it was just after the war in Ukraine had begun, and we talked about the idea of a new Cold War, that, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Has your thinking, or what have you learned in some ways, ever since that invasion now more than a year on?
That the Russian army is not as capable or fearsome as we might have assumed, that the Ukrainians have proved far more capable than we might have assumed. And I think perhaps most importantly, from the point of view of this NATO summit, we have learned that in part because Russia has not been particularly successful in Ukraine, that European countries that a year ago were talking about a Zeitenwende or a changing of the minds on how they handle defense, they've very much reverted to old patterns, fallen back into the familiar habits of relying on the United States that's characterized that relationship for a long time.
And when you talk about, what we've learned about Russia, how does the recent attempted mutiny change Western thinking or change the approach of NATO?
It has I think, increased the awareness of the idea that this war is not necessarily good for stability inside Russia. I don't think there are many people that believe that Putin's regime is going to collapse tomorrow. But this is, I think, a reminder that there are people inside Russia that are unhappy with the war, and perhaps more importantly, that there are groups within Russia that are unhappy with how badly the war is being fought. So they're not anti-war, they would prefer it to be more competently fought. And so I think this reminder of Russian domestic politics and the fact that there are, groups that are both perhaps better and worse than Vladimir Putin is a bit of a reminder to Western policymakers.
And before we talk about the summit and what Ukraine are demanding and how Ukraine will be central to all of this, NATO and the West frame that war as a battle of democracy versus autocracy, Ukraine versus Russia. But, Sweden is still being denied its membership to NATO because of being held up by Turkey. Hungary also causing issues, as it also did with Finland's membership. Is that a problem as well for NATO, that there are two countries which many would argue are themselves veering towards an autocracy, and that doesn't look great for NATO when it comes to that wider PR of democracy versus autocracy?
NATO has always had this problem, the democracy versus autocracy one. Effectively ever since both Greece and Turkey were admitted back during the Cold War. And they were admitted because they're strategically significant countries in geographically important areas. And so this bigger question of whether NATO is a defense alliance or a club for democracies, that's one that has characterized the organization's history for decades.
This week is the NATO summit in Lithuania. Ukraine's President Zelensky will attend, despite his country not being a member, and that's a big issue for the talks. Back in 2008, at another NATO summit, the alliance said that Ukraine would eventually become a member, and that was supported by then US President George W. Bush.
NATO should welcome Georgia and Ukraine into the Membership Action Plan. And NATO membership must remain open to all of Europe's democracies that seek it.
But membership never came, and 6 years later, Russia annexed Crimea, and then later launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Kyiv now wants NATO to give it a clear path to membership, something that some members agree with, but others do not, such as President Joe Biden.
I don't think there is unanimity in NATO about whether or not to bring Ukraine into the NATO family now, at this moment, in the middle of a war.
With the summit set to see NATO members speak of the alliance being renewed and reinvigorated, there will also be some key areas of disagreement.
NATO membership was first sort of mooted to Ukraine 15 years ago. You wrote about that sort of dithering on NATO membership with Ukraine as well as on other nations' membership. You said, the unwillingness to contemplate any alternative path for Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova contributed to a toxic stew of political disputes, security fears, and imperialist ambition that ultimately brought the region to the brink of war. Can you just briefly explain that and what you were thinking there?
Does NATO expansion bring greater security to Eastern Europe, or has it caused increased conflict with Russia? And the truth, I think, is somewhere in the middle, right? Russia clearly has imperialist ambitions towards the countries immediately around its borders, but the prospect of NATO expansion, I think, has made that problem worse. And has helped to produce the invasions that we've seen over the last decade. So the concerning thing when we start to talk about the Vilnius summit and about Ukraine and NATO membership is the mistake that we made in 2008 under the George W. Bush administration was that Ukraine and Georgia were told, no immediate path to NATO membership, but we're also not closing that door. Someday it will happen. And it's looking very much like something similar is going to happen in Vilnius. Ukraine is going to be told someday, but not now.
It may, I guess, seem in some ways obvious, but I mean, what is the number one concern for the likes of Germany or other countries within NATO for just saying, yes, Ukraine can join?
Well, and I should be clear, I oppose Ukraine joining NATO as well. And I think many people who have thought seriously about security implications do so as well. So there are the immediate security concerns. NATO does not typically admit countries that have territorial disputes on their land. And so, even if this larger conflict is over, there still remain the questions of Crimea and those territories in eastern Ukraine that the Russians have been occupying for 8 years now. In addition to that, Ukraine is a significantly larger country than many of the existing Eastern European NATO members. Defending Ukraine would be extremely difficult. And so the fear is, and I think it's a very rational fear, is that letting Ukraine into NATO merely increases the likelihood that we end up in a shooting war with Russia directly at some point. And that's a significant risk.
But is that not the point of NATO in some ways, is to not be beholden to what Russia might do? It's to defend nations against Russia. And I mean, NATO's already, arming Ukraine quite heavily. At one point it said we couldn't send tanks, then it sent tanks, then you couldn't send fighter jets, and now they can. I mean, NATO's already kind of at war with Russia anyway, aren't they?
If you believe the Russians, that's certainly true. But if you were to ask the White House, they would say no. In a nutshell, NATO relies on deterrence. Can you prevent Russia from starting a conflict rather than actually having to fight it? And I think in Ukraine, even in the future, even 10 years down the line, that is a much more difficult bet to make. And it's one that I think policymakers would be quite foolish to actually put all their eggs in that basket.
It was a sort of argument, during the Cold War, NATO expanded. During the Cold War, West Germany was admitted, at the height of the Cold War when that country was divided. Is that comparison apt here when it comes to, Ukraine saying, let us into NATO?
I think it could be in some period of time, but you would need a much more stable battlefield than you have right now. The two analogies that come up a lot are the West German example and then also the example of the Koreas and the armistice there. And the problem is that today, there's an active ongoing Ukrainian offensive, territories changing hands every day. That there is in effect no clear demarcation line between Ukrainian forces and Russian forces, and that is simply not stable enough to say we will admit some part of this country but not another part, right? When West Germany was admitted, they did not say that they were planning to retake portions of Eastern Germany, for example.
NATO membership may not be offered now, but NATO membership and even EU membership could be offered as some sort of fig leaf to the Ukrainians further down the line when it comes to the negotiating table to say, look, we're sorry you have to give away some land to Russia, but we'll give you NATO and EU membership.
I think there's some of that thinking involved. I think particularly, even if it's not full membership in NATO or the European Union, I think particularly the notion that you might offer Ukraine, preferential trade status, some kind of, European Union-like status as they go through the membership process, that could be sort of a carrot for the Ukrainians as they move towards negotiations. But I should mention the thing we haven't talked about at all is the notion of security guarantees that aren't intrinsically tied to NATO itself. And it does seem like that is where the White House and also the UK and France and others are moving in recent weeks.
So let's pick up on that point then. Is that the idea that, when it comes to security guarantees, and we're speaking ahead of this summit, you're looking at something like what the US has with Israel, it offers technically, formally no security guarantee, but it carries on providing weapons to the state of Israel over the last few decades.
Yeah, so the phrase that has been bandied about in Washington a lot lately is the Israel model. And it's a very poorly defined term, I think, in part because there really is no Israel model, right? This is something that evolved over 7 or 8 decades. And it started small, providing arms to the Israelis to defend themselves, but not offering a concrete security guarantee. And over time, it has become something more than that. But I think the reason why the White House is considering this for Ukraine and the reason why it's getting sort of so much interest is the idea that you could help Ukraine to defend itself without necessarily incurring the risks of full NATO membership, bears a pretty strong resemblance to some of the decisions that the United States was making when it first offered arms to Israel during the Cold War, that it wanted Israel to be able to defend itself, it wanted to maintain a regional balance of power in the Middle East, but it also wanted good relations with the Arab states. And so that there are some similarities, and I think that's why policymakers are moving in this direction towards more informal guarantees.
Another difference among NATO members ahead of this summit is the issue of cluster bombs. Last week, the United States announced that it was sending the weapons to Ukraine, but President Biden called that a very difficult decision. That's because many countries have banned them because they are a danger to civilians. Cluster bombs are bombs that release smaller bomblets that can kill indiscriminately. Biden said that Ukraine needed weapons for its ongoing war and counteroffensive, but NATO members have criticized the decision. Spain's defense minister said no to cluster bombs and yes to the legitimate defense of Ukraine, which we understand should not be carried out with cluster bombs. Once again, some cracks in the NATO alliance.
In a wider sense then, in terms of how the West and NATO approaches Ukraine and the war, is it really about where this war might end? And does the West and NATO think, and do they need Ukraine to ultimately win this war if they still think that's actually possible?
So I think there's two issues here, right? So one relates to the war in Ukraine, how much progress the Ukrainians can make, whether we are aiming for some kind of ceasefire, stalemate, or some kind of political settlement, right? Those are all the big questions about the war in Ukraine. And I think in general, there's a growing sense of pessimism that the Ukrainians are not going to be able to take back everything, that, we're probably not looking at an absolute Ukrainian victory. That's what the military analysts have been saying for a year, but I think politics is catching up to it. So that's one issue. But on the other side, it's interesting that we're talking about the Vilnius summit, and we've basically just talked about Ukraine the whole time. And that is what I think we may see in Vilnius too, rather than a broader discussion of things like NATO defense spending commitments, whether the new rotational or permanent brigades in the East are being provided by countries, whether countries are following through on the commitments they made in Madrid at the last summit. All of that has been sort of subsumed under this discussion of whether Ukraine's going in NATO, and that doesn't seem to me to be particularly healthy for the alliance in general.
Is there that thinking that this could be some sort of Korean War type end, a ceasefire that lasts for decades and decades, but you still have two countries technically at war?
I think the general sense is that a broader peace settlement is probably not going to happen, that the Ukrainians aren't willing to officially cede any territory, that the Russians aren't willing to officially admit they lost, or to give any concessions to Ukraine. And so a Korean-style kind of armistice that leaves troops in place along a demilitarized zone or along a line of contact, that is probably the path of least resistance. But the problem is that is a recipe in some ways for further instability. We still see clashes between North and South Korea to this day, some of them, relatively costly, even in the last 5 or 10 years. And it can be fairly unstable.
But even to get to that armistice, you need dialogue. Do you get a sense that there is moves from Moscow, Kyiv, Washington and beyond to have some formal dialogue?
We know that there have been meetings between Bill Burns, who is the director of the CIA, and some of his Russian counterparts. And so that I think is a start. The real question is what happens in this Ukrainian offensive. It's been going 3 or 4 weeks at this point, depending. It has not been particularly successful so far, but that does not mean that we couldn't see some major breakthrough. And, I think I would say in the case where there is very little progress made by Ukraine, there will probably be pressure from the West on Ukraine to push for peace talks. If the Ukrainians make a major breakthrough, that might be reversed, and you might see the Russians more willing to talk than the Ukrainians.
In terms of if NATO is to move forward and sort of change rather than revert to type, this summit is in Lithuania. The Baltic states are the ones who in many ways since the war have said, we told you, we always warned you about the Russian threat. In fact, the Finns in joining NATO said we should have listened to the Baltic states when they warned us about Russia's intentions. Is that where NATO should be shifting in some ways towards listening to the Eastern European nations, which have always said Russia is the number one threat?
I mean, this is certainly a line that you will hear if you talk to policymakers inside NATO. If you talk to policymakers in the East, you'll hear that the center of gravity in Europe has shifted towards the East. I do think that's misleading in a certain way. The states in Eastern Europe are still, for the most part, small, relatively militarily insignificant. They need the budgets and arms of their Western European neighbors, or they at least need a way to come together on defense if they're ever going to be able to actually defend themselves. So instead, what we've seen developing is this kind of triangle where President Macron and others in Western Europe are pushing that the result of the Ukraine war should be, increased European defense and capabilities and potentially, more independent decision-making of the US. And then on the other hand, we have the Eastern European states who are effectively doing everything they can to pull the US in ever closer to NATO because they fear what they might end up with if they don't have those US capabilities and they're forced to depend on the Western Europeans.
The Baltic states will always keep saying we need more defense on the eastern flank. Russia will always be a threat. Move away from relying on America, especially because who knows what would happen if Joe Biden was, defeated by Donald Trump or another Republican who isn't committed to Ukraine nor NATO. Is that where NATO needs to also start thinking about its future?
I certainly think so. There are a lot of people here in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere who will tell you that NATO has emerged from the last 18 months much strengthened, that the transatlantic bonds are as strong as ever, and things like that. And I suspect we'll see a lot of that sort of lovey-dovey alliance unity stuff in Vilnius. But in reality, Joe Biden is a very strongly transatlanticist president. His successors, whether they are Republicans or Democrats, are not likely to be so strongly supportive. Particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, we have both, I think, a strong sentiment growing among the Republican grassroots that U.S. spending in Europe on defense is too much and is unfair for the U.S. taxpayer. They're generally opposed to further aid to Ukraine. And then I think also among Republican elites on foreign policy side, a growing sense that the U.S. needs to pivot and focus more on China. And when you put those two things together, I think, I'm not saying a future Republican president would withdraw from NATO, but I do think Europeans are going to have to start doing more over the coming years. Maybe they get a reprieve if Joe Biden gets elected, but we're still looking at 4 or 8 years down the road. They're going to have to do more.
Emma Ashford, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for having me.